In this video, we combine some of the most disturbing cave diving tragedies we've covered on this channel so far. From divers who got lost in the silt, to divers that made a wrong turn and struggled to find their way out. If you enjoy watching these videos, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more exciting cave diving stories like these. The first two stories of this cave diving marathon happened in Jacob's Well. Jacob's Well is a natural spring that is active all year and is found in the Texas Hill Country. The water flows from Cypress Creek's bed, and the spring is situated to the northwest of Wimberley, Texas. The Hays County Parks Department manages the area where the spring is located, which is called Jacob's Well Natural Area. The spring's mouth is 12 feet in diameter and is a popular swimming spot for locals. The opening of the spring in the creek bed leads to Jacob's Well Cave, which descends vertically for approximately 30 feet before continuing downward at an angle. The cave consists of a sequence of silted chambers divided by narrow restrictions, culminating in an average depth of 120 feet. Before modern times, the natural artesian spring, which is fed by the Trinity Aquifer, spewed water from the cave's opening. Cave divers from the Jacob's Well Exploration Project have explored and mapped the system, revealing that it comprises two main conduits. The first passage stretches roughly 4,500 feet from the surface and reaches a maximum depth of 137 feet. The second passage diverges from the primary conduit and is approximately 1,000 feet long. The cave is a popular destination for open water divers, but not all of them have the necessary training or equipment for cave diving, which has led to 9 deaths at this location between 1964 and 1984, 8 men and 1 woman. Kent Maupin, who was 20 years old at the time, was a seasoned diver. He was friends with Mark Brashear, a 20-year-old San Jacinto College student who worked part-time at a dive shop in Pasadena as an assistant instructor. Mark was aware that 4 divers had lost their lives in the same section of the Jacob's Well that Kent was interested in exploring. Any dive that far into the cave was very risky and required careful planning and specialized equipment. Kent had often talked about diving into the last chamber of Jacob's Well, which had a notorious reputation. Although the well was a relatively safe dive up to a certain point, Kent was determined to go beyond that point and explore how far the submerged cave extended and where it led. Kent and his friend Mark Brashear had joined a group of divers from Pasadena and camped out at Jacob's Well in Wimberley. Joe Moe and another group of divers were also present. At around midnight on September 9, 1979, Kent, Mark, and a few others went for a dive into the well. The other divers soon realized that Kent and Mark were headed towards the much-avoided 4th chamber. The first chamber of the well descends straight down about 25 feet. The second chamber goes down an additional 35 feet, and the third chamber slopes gradually, narrowing to a depth of 75 feet. At the end of the third chamber, there's an opening that leads to the 4th chamber. Several people who have ventured into the 4th chamber before had not returned alive. At around midnight that evening, the 2 young men were observed at the entrance to the chamber, moving back into the opening and dragging their tanks along with them. Joe was shocked to witness the scene because he knew that the 2 didn't have any backup lights or safety lines. They seemed to be motivated only by an impulse to explore further. Kent removed his tank back into the narrow passage and pulled the tank behind him. Mark did the same. Joe saw Mark disappear into the tunnel. Joe was taken aback because nobody had talked to him about it. He signaled his light back and forth, attempting to get Mark's attention, but Mark wouldn't look up at him. He just gazed down at his tank and pulled it with him into the darkness. Joe was aware that Kent and Mark's steel tanks held less air than his aluminum ones, and since they were deeper, their air consumption would be greater. As Joe began to run low on the air himself, he realized that the situation was serious. He tried to get their attention by banging on his tank with his knife, but received no response. Joe left his light shining in the passage, hoping they would follow it to find their way out. After he surfaced, the clear water of the well turned murky, which could have been caused by either a gravel slide or two panic-stricken divers stirring up silt. Joe knew that it was highly likely that Kent and Mark had died. Don Dibble and Paul Battaglia were informed of the accident by a San Marcos police officer and arrived at the scene soon after. Don was a former Navy diver with the highest rating in the Professional Association of Diving Instructors. Despite knowing that there was no chance of finding the divers alive, they attempted to rescue them anyway. They called two other members of the Hays County Volunteer Body Recovery Unit, collected some equipment from Dom's dive shop, and headed to Wimberley, where they found the exhausted and shocked group of surviving divers who had unsuccessfully searched for the bodies since the accident. One of the divers claimed to have seen the bodies buried beneath a pile of gravel. Don observed the well, which was a black hole at that hour, and decided to wait until the morning before attempting the recovery. He called the dead ex-persons in his private language, indicating that they could wait until daylight. However, as it was already dark in Jacob's well, if the bodies were visible, it would be an easy recovery. Don instructed two divers to descend and evaluate the situation to determine whether the recovery process would be as easy as he had been led to believe. Unfortunately, the divers were unable to see the bodies, and the passage was almost entirely blocked by gravel. When they returned to the surface, they were anxious about the situation because that section of the cave floor was steep, and a large amount of unstable gravel was set to tumble down and bury anyone in its path. Dom decided to return to San Marcos, assemble a larger crew and more equipment, and return during daylight. They returned to the well at 10 o'clock in the morning, and two divers carefully began to move the gravel through the passage using trowels to create an opening large enough for them to pass. However, this process only made the already terrible conditions worse. Don decided to go down into the well himself after receiving different reports about the feasibility of the recovery mission. He was accompanied by a game warden named Calvin Turner, and they left spare tanks at 25 and 75 feet while reeling out safety line as they descended further into the well. They shone their lights upward into the ceiling crevice of the third room to ensure that the bodies were not floating above them. The entrance where the two divers had last been seen was still blocked. Don checked his submersible pressure gauge and found that he had 1,100 pounds per square inch of air left, which would last about 10 minutes at that depth. He cautiously placed his head and shoulders into the entrance, holding onto the safety line with one hand and shining his light ahead with the other. He saw nothing, but small pieces of gravel struck his mask lens due to the water's flow through the constriction. Don realized that removing the bodies would not be possible unless the unstable gravel bed was cleared. He also became aware of the danger he was in, but it was too late. He became trapped in the passage entrance due to a slide of gravel. The water became murky, and Don was unable to see. His arms were stuck, and he could not signal Turner or bang on his tank. As he struggled to free himself, his breathing rate increased, and he quickly ran out of air. Don came to the realization that he was about to die, but he remained calm and tried to die quietly. Don was uncertain about the process of drowning and how it led to his death. He thought that he could hasten the process by either inhaling or drinking water. However, he realized that inhaling water would cause him to panic and thrash, which would lead to embarrassment for his wife. Therefore, he chose to drink the water that was suffocating him. As he took a few gulps, he felt dizzy and accepted his fate. Suddenly, an involuntary reflex seized him, and he thrashed around, freeing himself. Through his flooded mask, he saw Calvin offering him the regulator from the spare tank. He took it and breathed in the air with relief. Don's problem started when he breathed in too much air while diving. The excessive intake of air caused some of it to enter his stomach instead of his lungs. As he rose to the surface, the decreasing water pressure made the trapped air expand. Don attempted to release the air by burping, but he was unsuccessful. He realized that if he did not ascend to the surface quickly, he would be at risk of getting decompression sickness along with his current predicament. Therefore, he continued to ascend while experiencing unbearable pain due to the expanding gas. By the time he surfaced, he appeared to have been pregnant for 9 months. Don removed his breathing regulator and let out a scream. He didn't feel any better until 12 hours later. His diving injury was a rare sight, and nobody had ever witnessed anything like it before. They thought it was some form of embolism, which is a common condition when expanding air becomes trapped in the lungs. The recommended treatment for this is a simulated dive in a recompression chamber, so Don was taken to Brooke Army Medical Center's chamber. Unfortunately, the treatment did not alleviate his pain, which remained severe. It wasn't until later, when Don was taken to another hospital, that a doctor ordered x-rays and discovered that his stomach wall had ruptured, causing peritonitis. Don should have already died from the condition, which was equivalent to having 5 ruptured appendixes. When the surgeon opened Don's swollen abdomen, it was like cutting into a basketball. During Don's recovery from his surgery, the search for the missing bodies continued. They brought in a well-regarded diver from Austin named Don Broad, who was 46 years old. He was known for being gruff and opinionated and had a deep fascination with Jacob's Well since he was a boy in El Campo. Broad dove down to the opening of the last passage and peered inside. He saw Dibble's light where it had been dropped, and behind it was a corridor filled with gravel that he believed held the bodies. Broad realized that Kent and Mark had to excavate the tunnel by shoveling the loose gravel behind them, putting their lives at risk for the sake of exploring a few more square feet of submerged limestone. Broad concluded that the only safe way to retrieve the bodies would be to airlift all the gravel out of the cave, starting from the top of the slope and working down. 2 days later, a flatbed truck carrying a white recompression chamber in the shape of a space capsule arrived at Jacob's Well. The chamber belonged to Schaefer Diving Company, which was hired by the families of the victims to retrieve the bodies. The owner of the company, Louis Schaefer, was optimistic about the operation's success and was the first diver to go down. After descending into the water, he remained visible from the surface until he reached the juncture at 25 feet, where he exclaimed, "God Almighty," upon seeing the entrance to the final passage. Later that afternoon, Lewis's divers used a large hose to suck out gravel from the 60-foot level and spew it into Cypress Creek downstream from the well. The divers also put larger rocks into burlap bags that volunteer scuba divers tied to ropes and hauled to the surface. However, the work proved difficult, as for every foot of gravel removed, another was replaced. Nevertheless, they persisted in their efforts. After some time, the search operation was stopped due to a lack of funds for 2 days. When the divers resumed their work, they found that the opening they had spent a week clearing had almost closed up again in the 2 days they were away. They were back where they had started, with a dangerous and exhausting task that could last for weeks or months, and they were now working without pay. Their effort was fruitless. Another group of divers from Brown and Root, sent by Chet Brooks for a second opinion, confirmed what Lewis's divers had eventually admitted to themselves. The best course of action was to leave the bodies where they were and seal off the well. So 12 days after Kent Maupin and Mark Brashear perished in Jacob's Well, the search for their bodies was terminated. Don tried to close off the depths of Jacob's Well by constructing a rebar and quickset concrete grate at the entrance to the third chamber after his recovery from the hospital in January 1980. However, 6 months later, the grate was discovered and dismantled. It was revealed that some divers who came equipped with the necessary tools removed the grate and left a message for Don on a plastic slate that read, "You can't keep us out." After a decade since the tragic incident, most of Mark's remains were found, but Kent's body was never recovered. Exactly 21 years later, Kent's remains were finally discovered, which would give his family the closure they had been seeking all this time, and he will be laid to rest. Wayne Russell, who started caving at the age of 15 in 1962, later joined the National Speleological Society. He dedicated himself to caving extensively in California, Texas, and Mexico, where he explored and mapped various water caves. Despite being a member of the NSS cave diving section, he did not receive certification as a cave diver. When he wasn't exploring caves, Wayne worked as a mail carrier in Austin, Texas. His primary focus during his caving expeditions was mapping and cave photography. Furthermore, he played an active role in the speleological community, serving as vice chairman and chairman of the Texas Speleological Association during the 1970s. Over the years, he also assisted in the formation of several caving clubs. On Sunday, February 26, 1984, 3 people entered Jacob's Well: John Wilcox, Danny Self, and Wayne Russell. Both John and Danny were scuba diving instructors who worked independently, while Wayne was an experienced caver and cave diver. The trio was carrying a full wetsuit, a single 80 cubic foot tank, a single-nose regulator with an octopus, depth and pressure gauge consoles, 2 to 3 lights each, and a spare 50 cubic foot tank. Due to the narrow passages, they did not have any buoyancy compensators. They met at the first level in the first chamber, which was 25 feet deep, and then extended a safety line vertically from that point to the beginning of the third chamber, which was 55 feet deep. At a depth of about 85 feet, Wayne and John established a new safety line by running it horizontally through the third chamber and halfway into the fourth chamber. Then Wayne led the way into the fifth chamber, passing through a narrow opening while pushing his tank in front of him and laying a new safety line. Meanwhile, John took pictures while following Wayne. Danny stayed back in the fourth chamber to maintain the safety lines and to search for an old tank left by 2 divers who drowned in the well in 1979 and were never found. Once Wayne and John proceeded beyond the sixth chamber, Danny explored the fourth chamber, estimating it to be roughly 10 feet high by 8 feet wide. After he finished, he retrieved some spare line, removed his tank, and squeezed through the passage. Once Danny was in the fourth chamber, he located the tank, attached a piece of line to it, and began to follow the safety line out. However, he was surprised to find that the fifth chamber was incredibly narrow, measuring only about 2 feet in height. Furthermore, the visibility was deteriorating rapidly, causing Danny to feel increasingly anxious. Halfway out, he became entangled in the line he had tied to the old tank and was unable to proceed any further. After taking a deep breath, he managed to untangle himself and return to the fourth chamber. He then put his tank back on and attempted to pull the old tank through the opening. Meanwhile, Wayne had tied his safety line halfway into the fifth chamber and had attached a survey tape, a 100-foot tape measure that he would use to measure the length and diameter of the lower chambers. Wayne then ventured into the sixth chamber and beyond. John followed Wayne's safety line and survey tape into the sixth chamber, where he took pictures. Due to poor visibility, John had difficulty taking pictures and seeing clearly. Nevertheless, he got the impression that the sixth chamber was quite spacious and had a muddy bottom, unlike the rocky bottom of the other chambers. Wayne signaled to John that it was time to leave, so John followed the safety line back. However, when he reached the opening, he found that the old tank was stuck. After dislodging it, he pushed it while Danny pulled it through the opening. Then Danny exited the fourth chamber with the old tank, while John exited the fifth, followed by Wayne. Later, in the third chamber, Danny and John met up. In the upper chamber, the visibility was slightly better compared to the lower chamber. Danny asked John about Wayne's whereabouts, and John indicated down the tunnel, assuming that Wayne was either setting up his survey tape or fixing his tank. Until then, there was no indication of any problem, so they decided to ascend to a shallower depth to start decompressing, assuming Wayne would catch up. However, midway through their decompression stop, they started to get concerned. They couldn't go back because they were low on air and had no bottom time. Eventually, they surfaced. The next day, a dive team from Wimberley found Wayne lying on his safety line with his mask on and his tank by his side at the beginning of the fifth chamber. After Wayne's death, his parents discovered a poem that he had written, which was read at his funeral. On February 29, 1984, this friend of the earth and caving was buried near Utopia, Texas. In 2015, when he was just 21 years old, Diego Adami decided to attempt a free dive into Jacob's Well, a cave in Texas. Diego Adami is a highly accomplished freediver from Mexico. He was born in Mexico City and grew up near the ocean, where he developed a love for water sports. He began his freediving journey in 2010 and quickly became one of the most successful freedivers in Mexico. Adami has achieved many impressive feats in the sport of freediving. He has set several national records in various disciplines of the sport, including constant weight, free immersion, and variable weight. In 2014, he set a national record in the constant weight discipline by diving to a depth of 101 meters in the Bahamas. This adventurous young man captured the entire experience of his free dive in Jacob's Well on camera. The footage shows Diego diving into Jacob's Well without any supplementary air. He descends to the bottom of the first aperture, which is about 100 feet beneath the surface. However, during the dive, one of Diego's flippers becomes detached from his foot, and he faces a significant challenge swimming back up to the surface without it. To add to the gravity of the situation, many divers have passed out in the past while attempting to resurface without a flipper. Despite these dangerous circumstances, Diego remained calm and quickly turned around in response to the incident. The situation worsened when, while pushing against the narrow walls of the cave, he accidentally dropped his flashlight. This incident left him feeling vulnerable and scared, and he subsequently remembered that for a short second, he thought about death and the possibility of dying that day. However, he was fortunate enough to maintain his composure and control his breathing to avoid using up the precious and limited oxygen supply that he had. Despite the danger and the fear, he quickly assessed the situation and came up with a plan to ensure his survival. Before he ran out of air, he decided to cut off his supply belt to reduce the excess weight, and he made his way back to the surface as quickly as possible. Despite the close call and the traumatic experience he had just been through, Diego's passion and excitement for perilous dives remained strong and steadfast. He expressed that he had no plans to stop freediving anytime soon, and even declared that he would be back in Jacob's Well for more diving adventures later in the summer. It was evident that his love for the thrill of the dive overpowered his fear of danger, and he was willing to take risks to satisfy his adventurous spirit. To tell the truth, this cave has proven dangerous on many accounts, and one will agree that only experienced cave divers should dive there. This is the exact reason why the Jacob's Well Exploration Project was established. The authorities figured it was best to carry out the work of exploration through this group of professionals and therefore curb the casualties that occurred in the cave. This is because at least 9 people, 1 woman and 8 men, lost their lives while attempting to explore the cave system at Jacob's Well. As the underwater caves at Jacob's Well pose a significant threat, the only organization authorized to explore them is the Jacob's Well Exploration Project. The Hays County Parks Department has granted the JWEP permission to conduct diving operations at Jacob's Well. In addition to mapping and exploration, the project conducts independent research and collaborates with various groups actively studying the site. Starting in the early 2000s, the JWEP began surveying the cave and has since mapped all accessible passageways, totaling 6,000 feet. Trained cave divers began exploring Jacob's Well underwater in 2000 as part of a research project with the Wimberley Valley Watershed Association. Members of the San Marcos Area Rescue Team, or SMART, were involved in mapping and obtaining video imagery of the cave system, but these efforts were abandoned by 2002. At this point, Jimmy Price, formerly of SMART, and Jeff Chance took it upon themselves to initiate an independent exploration effort. They spent months clearing large amounts of rock and gravel that had accumulated on the gravel slope, leading to the first major restriction, which allowed them to regain access to the interior of the cave. Upon re-entering the cave, these divers discovered that it did not end at the previously reported point, and that it continued for several hundred feet into the karstic limestone. The first stage of the survey work produced a partial map of A tunnel's deep section and a large portion of B tunnel. This map was presented to David Baker, the landowner of the property and executive director of the Wimberley Valley Watershed Association, to aid in preserving the unique resource. As dives became more complex, more people joined the efforts. In 2004, Ryan and Andrea Eastman, as well as Rhett and Brooke Carson, became involved and played a crucial role in further extending the exploration of both A and B tunnels. The following year, longer multi-hour dives necessitated additional support. Ward Beecher and Chuck Noe joined in at this point, and with their help, the exploration and initial survey of the system was completed. In 2007, many members of the Good Enough Springs Exploration Project were recruited to join them, and together they became the Jacobs Well Exploration Project. This group of volunteers, self-funded cave divers, have continued to explore and conduct research activities. So far, they have mapped and surveyed all currently accessible areas of the cave system and recorded around 6,000 feet of passages in the two primary conduits. Valuable information obtained from their surveying dives has enabled the project to create a highly detailed map of the entire cave system, which has been shared with various entities involved in aquifer protection efforts. The project survey results reveal Jacobs Well to be the longest cave in Hays County, and at the same time, it is the second longest totally submerged known cave in Texas. Florida's Blue Spring, which is located in Volusia County, is noteworthy and prominent. This spring is categorized as a first magnitude spring, meaning it releases a minimum of 100 cubic feet of water per second. The term first magnitude refers to the largest springs, and there are a total of 27 of these in Florida. Blue Spring ranks as the 17th largest in terms of water release among these 27 springs. Blue Spring State Park is a top spring in Florida and the largest on the St. Johns River. The first magnitude spring releases water close to a depth of about 240 feet and has dimensions of about 360 by 160 feet, which is equivalent to the size of a soccer field. It's a natural sanctuary for the endangered West Indian manatees during the winter. Aside from manatees, Blue Spring also hosts a diverse range of freshwater and saltwater fish. The spring opening at Blue Spring is approximately 20 feet deep from the land surface and is connected to a 125-foot cave system. This cave is a popular destination for cave divers. The spring is divided into 3 areas. One area is accessible to all visitors, while another is strictly off-limits to protect the manatee sanctuary. The third area, designated as the second manatee refuge, is open to visitors who want to observe the manatees. Additionally, the Amerindian Temple Mound is located at Blue Spring, where Native Americans, also known as Amerindians, lived before the Europeans arrived in North and South America. Julian, a resident of Fort Lauderdale, Florida, has been passionate about diving since he was a teenager. His love for the underwater world has taken him to different cave systems across Florida, Mexico, and South America. Apart from his interest in diving, Julian is also an avid climber. He finds solace and thrill in the breathtaking views from the top of the mountains. His adventures in climbing have taken him to various parts of the world, exploring the beauty of nature and testing his limits. Julian is known to be a dedicated and serious individual who puts his heart and soul into everything he does. His focus is to build a career in diving, and he aspires to become a diving instructor after completing his training and fulfilling all the requirements. Julian and his friend Todd Williams, who is also a qualified diver, have always been fascinated by the underwater world. They had planned to explore the cave system at Blue Spring in the past, but unfavorable weather conditions forced them to abandon their plans. However, they were determined to return to the site someday and complete their dive. 2 years later, Julian and Todd found themselves in the vicinity of Blue Spring, with an opportunity to finally explore the cave system they had longed to see. Despite their diving experience, they knew that the Volusia cave system was unfamiliar territory, so they decided to hire a dive guide named Marcus. Marcus had extensive knowledge of the Volusia cave system, and he shared valuable insights with Julian and Todd before the dive. He pointed out potential hazards and helped them navigate through the cave system safely. The morning of the dive at Blue Spring had finally arrived, and Julian, Todd, and Marcus were ready to explore the cave system. They got suited up and began their preparations for the dive. Before descending, they conducted buoyancy checks at a depth of 23 feet to ensure they were all comfortable and ready for the dive. Although Todd was showing signs of nervousness, they both exchanged OK signals with Marcus, indicating that they were ready to proceed with the dive. They began their descent into the cave system. As they ventured further into the cave, Todd began to feel uneasy and signaled to Julian and Marcus that he wanted to end the dive and wait for them on the surface. Julian and Marcus, who were determined to continue the dive, reassured Todd that they would be back soon and that he should wait for them at the surface. With Todd safely on the surface, Julian and Marcus continued the dive, eager to explore more of the cave system. They swam through the narrow passages, marveling at the stunning rock formations and the fascinating marine life that surrounded them. After a while, they decided it was time to start their ascent to the surface. As Julian and Marcus made their way back after a successful exploration of the cave system, Julian began to feel increasingly nervous. He started to panic and lose focus, which was immediately noticeable to Marcus, who was following closely behind. Concerned about Julian's condition, Marcus asked if he needed help, but Julian insisted that he could manage on his own. However, Marcus continued to keep a close eye on him, knowing that panic can quickly escalate in a diving situation. Suddenly, Marcus noticed that Julian was dumping gas from his buoyancy control device, and then he started to descend again. Marcus quickly swam over to Julian to assess the situation and noticed that he was frantically signaling to go up in a hurry. Marcus realized that Julian was in a state of panic and needed to be calmed down to allow for a controlled ascent. He tried to communicate with Julian, urging him to take deep breaths and relax to allow a controlled ascent. As they began their ascent, Julian's behavior became increasingly erratic. He was alternately swinging his arm and gripping Marcus's arms, causing him to lose his regulator twice. Marcus, an experienced diver, quickly went behind Julian and held on to his cylinder handle as he swam him toward the guideline. Once they were properly aligned, Marcus changed his position to face Julian, and they started to ascend together. Julian continued to grip Marcus tightly by both his upper arms, which left noticeable indentations and slight bruising on Marcus's skin after he removed his wetsuit. Despite the challenging circumstances, Marcus remained calm and collected, using Julian's BCD to control their ascent while he dumped his own BCD. After ascending 22 feet, Julian lost his regulator once again, and Marcus quickly replaced it in his mouth. Marcus noticed that Julian's breathing had become rapid and shallow. At 8 feet, Marcus noticed that Julian was foaming at the mouth and that the foam was coming out through his regulator. Julian appeared to be unconscious, but he was still exhaling, and white foam was filling his mask. Marcus knew that Julian was in serious trouble and needed immediate help. The pair quickly surfaced, and Marcus immediately released Julian's weight belt, letting it drop to the seabed. Marcus then removed his own BCD and Julian's BCD to help Julian get more air. He checked Julian's airway and saw that he was still exhaling foam. Marcus knew that time was of the essence and that Julian needed urgent medical attention. Marcus immediately called out to Todd for help, who was nearby, and they both rushed over to Julian. Upon reaching the scene, Todd could see the situation of his friend, and the seriousness of the situation caused him to panic. However, he quickly gained his composure, and together with Marcus, they worked to pull Julian out of the water. Marcus placed Julian in Todd's care, who immediately started assessing his condition. Marcus turned his attention to their equipment, which they had to leave behind in the water. They had to retrieve their buoyancy control devices and other gear to ensure that it was not lost in the water. With Todd watching over Julian, Marcus recovered their equipment and made sure that it was secured. Afterward, he returned to Julian, who was still unconscious and exhibiting concerning symptoms. Julian was exhaling foam and vomit, which made it difficult to determine the extent of his injuries. Todd was visibly devastated to see his friend in that helpless position. Marcus immediately called the dive center to alert the emergency services of the life-threatening situation. The staff at the dive center immediately alerted the emergency services, who quickly arrived on the scene. An ambulance was dispatched, and the paramedics took over Julian's care. Marcus and Todd watched as the ambulance rushed Julian to the nearest hospital. Once they arrived at the hospital, Julian was quickly taken into the emergency room. The doctors and nurses worked to save his life, but unfortunately, despite their best efforts, they were unable to revive him. The news was devastating for everyone, especially Marcus and Todd, who had been with Julian during his final moments. The reason for Julian's panic during the dive will forever remain a mystery. However, the events that followed serve as a caution for all divers. Panic is a serious threat to divers, and it can strike at any time, even for experienced divers. All divers need to recognize the signs of panic and take steps to prevent it from happening. Rapid, shallow breathing can lead to hypoxia, which is a condition that occurs when the body is deprived of oxygen. This can cause a buildup of carbon dioxide in the body, which is deadly. The diver can start acting irrationally, breathing faster, and even removing the regulator, which is a critical piece of equipment that allows divers to breathe underwater. In some cases, panic can lead to a diver rushing to the surface. This can be incredibly dangerous, as the rapid ascent can cause the diver to experience decompression sickness, which is also dangerous. Panic responses can also cause a diver to pass out, which can be deadly if they are underwater at the time. For divers with weak hearts, panic can even cause a heart attack. Recognizing the signs of panic is critical for all divers. These signs can include rapid breathing, shaking, sweating, and an elevated heart rate. If a diver experiences these symptoms, it is essential to take action immediately. This may involve taking slow, deep breaths, focusing on a fixed point, and calming oneself down. In extreme cases, it may be necessary to surface slowly and safely end the dive. Two friends, Craig Simon and John Robinson, decided to explore one of the most dangerous expert-level dive sites in the world once again, the Eagle's Nest. Many divers, even professionals, always avoid this cave unless it's necessary. No diver was willing to dive with John, which made Craig accept the offer, even though it was against his wife's wish. Would this be a decision they would live to regret, or just another walk-in-the-park expedition? Eagle's Nest Sinkhole is a highly advanced cave diving location situated in West Central Florida and notorious for being one of the most perilous diving sites across the globe. There have been numerous fatalities in the cave network, and only adequately trained experts who have first-hand knowledge of the cave's layout should even consider entering. The sinkhole is located in the Chassahowitzka Wildlife Management Area, an area renowned for having some of the most remarkable underwater cave systems globally. From a surface-level perspective, Eagle's Nest Sinkhole is not a visually impressive sight, resembling a green pond overrun with algae in a swamp. Unlike neighboring springs such as Buford Springs or Weeki Wachee, the water in Eagle's Nest is not inviting, as it is murky and appears to be teeming with alligators, swarms of mosquitoes, and ticks. There are few reasons to linger and no signs of breathtaking natural wonder lurking below the surface. Nonetheless, for the handful of daring adventurers who possess the ability to safely navigate Eagle's Nest, it is an underwater paradise, a world-class cave system boasting stunning scenery. The visibility in Eagle's Nest is highly variable and heavily influenced by current conditions, such as the state of the Florida aquifer and recent rainfall levels. Cave divers use a message board to record dive conditions, with reports ranging from unlimited visibility to zero visibility, making it like diving by braille. Occasionally, the water can be dyed with natural tannins, resulting in dark water, while other times, when conditions are optimal, the water is completely clear, making it feel like you're in another world. Eagle's Nest is both captivating and thrilling, but also dangerous, representing an extremely advanced and perilous cave dive that only experienced and certified experts should attempt. It's easy to become lost in the cave system, and there is no safe section where divers can orient themselves. The cave is notorious and unforgiving, requiring local knowledge and first-hand experience, even among experts. In some places, the cave is so narrow that divers must squeeze and squirm through claustrophobic openings, making it a struggle to pass with their gear. However, this feature makes it dangerous and has tragically claimed the lives of many untrained and unqualified explorers who have been drawn to the site. 36-year-old John Robinson was born and raised on Long Island, New York, and he had an undying love for diving. His passion for exploring underwater began to grow during his days at the University of Florida, where he pursued a master's degree and also learned to dive like a pro in the early 90s. After working in California, John realized his heart was still in Florida and returned to kickstart his career as an electrical engineer. But his love for diving never waned. Every weekend, he found solace in the caves, thanks to his certification as a cave diver. He was so meticulous with his gear that his friends often teased him for his obsession. But he didn't care. He knew the risks of cave diving in Florida and wasn't willing to take any chances. Despite his parents' worries about the potential dangers of cave diving, John was a master at his craft. Then he met Craig Simon through a mutual friend, and the two quickly bonded over their love for diving and the technical aspects involved. They went on numerous dives together and formed a great friendship within the first year of their partnership. Craig Simon, 44, was born in Manhattan, and he was a charismatic Italian who loved the great outdoors. It was in New York City that he first heard of scuba diving, and from then on, he was hooked. Intrigued by every aspect of the sport, he poured himself into researching it and eventually moved to Florida to indulge his passion for nature. Diving quickly became one of Craig's favorite hobbies, and he became a certified diver. But he didn't stop there, for Craig was a man who dreamed big. He longed for a career that would allow him to be outside and not chained to a desk all day. And his dream became a reality when he founded a landscaping business. Craig adored his wife and 3 sons, and when he wasn't exploring the depths of the ocean, he would spend quality time with his family. But as passionate as he was about his business and his loved ones, diving still held a special place in his heart. After 20 years of experience, Craig decided to take his love for diving to new heights by getting more serious about cave diving. He was quickly welcomed into the tight-knit cave diving community, forming close bonds with local divers such as John Robinson and the legendary Paul Heinrich. Craig looked up to Paul as a diver because he had an impressive record of cave explorations worldwide, dating back to the 1970s when he first dove Eagle's Nest. Paul was a pioneer in open water and cave diving, having instructed for the National Association of Cave Divers and the National Speleological Society Cave Diving Section for over 36 years. Even National Geographic had taken notice of his work in Florida, Mexico, the Bahamas, and even Antarctica. On one fateful day, John and Craig had a harrowing experience in a cave that shook them to their core. John, a seasoned cave diver, suffered a panic attack while exploring the water-filled cave and came dangerously close to drowning. Thankfully, Craig was able to calm him down and bring him back to the surface, but they both knew that they had dodged a bullet. The close call left them traumatized, and they took a break from diving to recuperate and reflect on what had happened. However, they were not ready to give up their passion just yet, and after some time, they felt ready to dive again. But Craig's wife was understandably worried about the safety of her husband and warned him not to dive with John again. Craig knew that John was an excellent diver and a trusted friend, but the previous incident had made him wary. He promised his wife that he would not go with John again. However, a week before their planned dive, John revealed that no one else was willing to dive with him. Craig felt torn between loyalty to his friend and his wife's fears. He remembered how John had taught him everything he knew about diving and how cautious and safe he had always been before the incident. In the end, Craig decided to take the risk and join John on their next adventure to one of their favorite sites, the Eagle's Nest Cave System. On Saturday, June 12, 2004, Craig and John met at the Eagle's Nest Cave for their planned exploration. They prepared for their exploration of the farthest parts of the Eagle's Nest downstream tunnels by using a combination of chemicals that granted them 2.5 hours of air inside the cave. Their dive plan involved a total of 40 minutes from the beginning of their descent to the end of their ascent, which included the necessary decompression. Their goal was to reach a distance of approximately 1,800 feet inside the cave, with a maximum depth of 300 feet. To ensure a safe trip, they had a sufficient amount of air supply that would last the estimated duration. In addition to this, they had high-quality dive scooters that allowed them to travel through the passages much faster than regular swimming. With the help of the scooters, they were able to reach a deeper part of the cave. They also brought stage tanks, which are extra air bottles used for decompression. To monitor their dive information in real time, they both wore wristband dive computers, which provided them with the necessary information for a successful dive. They began their exploration of the Eagle's Nest at around 1 p.m. As they descended through the first cave passage, they took the time to stage their decompression tanks before continuing their descent into the cave. After descending approximately 40 feet, they squeezed through a narrow chimney resembling an hourglass and into the ballroom, which is known as the entrance room. This large chamber measures 150 feet wide and has major passages leading to both upstream and downstream sections of the cave. Craig and John decided to follow the downstream tunnel, which gradually descended to a depth of 200 feet before abruptly dropping down a pit to 290 feet. Leading to a series of spacious rooms and passages. They planned to spend some time exploring these rooms beyond the pit before returning to the entrance room for decompression stops at 200 feet and again at the entrance room. They eventually arrived at John's Pocket, one of the most confined areas of the cave. This place was exceptionally small and could provoke feelings of claustrophobia. Suddenly, Craig veered away from the guideline to investigate whether the narrow part of John's Pocket was an uncharted tunnel. After some time had passed, Craig and John failed to return to their pre-planned check-in time of 3:30 p.m., causing concern among nearby divers at Eagle's Nest. One of them noticed that Craig and John had not used their stage bottles, which immediately raised alarm bells. He searched inside the entrance to Eagle's Nest, but found no sign of the two divers. Worried for their safety, he called for help. Shortly after receiving the call for assistance on Saturday at around 3:30 p.m., members of the Pasco and Citrus County underwater recovery teams, along with volunteers, quickly arrived at the entrance of Eagle's Nest to search for Craig and John. However, they soon realized that the conditions were beyond their capabilities and called for certified cave divers to assist in the search. Approximately 40 rescue divers were summoned to take part in the operation. Paul Heinerth personally assured Craig's family that he would find Craig and John. As he entered the cave, he moved quickly yet cautiously, scanning for any signs of his friends. Eventually, he found himself in John's Pocket, a particularly cramped and unsettling part of the cave. There, his light caught sight of John's diving scooter, partially buried in the silty floor. Next to it lay John's body, with his gear still operational but his air tanks empty. With the help of support divers, John's body was removed from the cave. Larry Green inspected John's dive computer and concluded that he may have become disoriented by the silt and unable to find an exit, ultimately becoming trapped in the room. Despite attempting to exit, John was unable to do so and was found in a position indicating he was trying to leave the cave. The rescue divers searched thoroughly but could not find any sign of Craig. It was peculiar that they were not together. Due to severe lightning and thunderstorms, the search had to be postponed for another day. The divers also needed some rest, as the operation could become more dangerous without it. During the break, they took time to regroup and decompress from the deep dive search attempts. John's parents were informed about their son's death by the sheriff's deputy after returning from a visit to their friends. The search for Craig resumed on Monday afternoon. The operation was risky, as the divers went more than 100 feet below the surface with compressed air, which made them vulnerable to the disorienting effects of nitrogen narcosis. While searching, rescue diver Larry Green experienced decompression sickness after diving 300 feet on 3 consecutive days. He was treated in a decompression chamber overnight and released the next day. The divers plan to conduct a more comprehensive search by diving deeper into the cavernous area, about 300 feet below ground, which could take up to 6 to 8 hours. The 2-person teams conducted several more dives that day, but Craig was still nowhere to be found. The next day's search was delayed until 5 p.m. due to the rain, and Craig's family anxiously waited at the muddy edge of the dive site. Despite encountering challenges, Paul was determined not to give up on the search for Craig. Upon reaching John's pocket, he opted for a different route and eventually spotted Craig's body tangled in the line while suspended in water. However, Paul did not see a guideline when he discovered Craig's scooter, but that doesn't imply that there wasn't one. Paul noted that having a scooter makes it tempting to take a quick look at something without running a line. However, this increases the risk of kicking up silt and things going wrong fast. As he ascended with Craig's body, Paul was overwhelmed with sadness for Craig's wife and children. Typically, it's challenging for close friends of lost divers to participate in the search due to the many theories about what could have gone wrong. Unfortunately, the truth behind Craig's demise will likely remain buried deep in the deadly cavern. While investigators did not suspect faulty equipment as the cause of John's death, Paul Hendricks emphasized that one cannot stray from the fundamental rules, despite how tempting it may seem. Although it's sad to hear about the loss of 2 talented individuals, let us use this unfortunate incident as a reminder of the risks involved in cave diving. As divers, we must prioritize our safety and always follow the guidelines to avoid any potential danger. Let us honor the memory of these men by diving responsibly and ensuring our well-being. While diving again after a 6-year break, a 51-year-old experienced diver realized that his dry suit was faulty at depth. His hope of survival relied on how fast his buddy could get him to the surface. Would he make it in time? The Dipolder sinks can be found on the Sandhill Scout Reservation, a place located off Highway 50 just east of Weeki Wachee in Hernando County, Florida. These sinks, known as Dipolder 2 and Dipolder 3, are intriguing submerged caves that offer a fascinating adventure for those who dare to explore them. These caves do not have just regular-sized chambers, but rather enormous rooms. Dipolder 2 reaches 360 feet, while Dipolder 3 takes you down to 300 feet. The Dipolder family, who owned the land where the caves are located, passed away in the mid to late 70s. In their passing, they chose to leave a lasting legacy by donating the property to the Boy Scouts. Following the acquisition of the property by the Boy Scouts, they took on the responsibility of managing and preserving these remarkable caves. To ensure the safety of all who venture into the depths, the Florida Speleological Researchers Program, or FSR, was established. It's the oldest guide program to exist today. The FSR program is not just about providing guidance. It also upholds certain principles and guidelines. These were put in place to guarantee that all diving operations conducted within the caves are executed with the utmost regard for the safety of the members. A 51-year-old diver named Keith Hendricks was an experienced cave diver who had over 18 years of diving experience. However, he had to undergo surgery at some point in his life, and this left him bedridden for close to a year before he miraculously regained his health. For 6 years, Keith did not dive. However, along the way, Keith met a new neighbor who was also a diver, although less experienced than he was. Mike Williams, who was 37 years old, had only performed about a half dozen dives since he was trained. After several discussions about cave diving, Keith realized that he had missed diving underwater and suggested to Mike that they go on a dive once more at Diepholder 3 Cave. Keith and Mike were getting ready for their dive at Diepholder 3 Cave. They planned to dive 147 feet. Mike thought it would be a good idea for Keith to go on a refresher dive since it had been a long time since he last went diving. He wanted to make sure Keith was comfortable and remembered all the necessary skills. However, Keith refused Mike's suggestion. He believed that his experience as a diver surpassed that of most diving instructors, so he didn't think there was anything to worry about. Before heading into the water, Keith carefully examined all his diving equipment. He checked his mask, fins, and other gear to ensure everything was in proper working condition. However, he noticed that his dry suit, which he used to keep himself dry and warm underwater, was no longer a perfect fit. It had become a bit tight in certain areas. Keith realized that he couldn't afford to buy a new one at the moment, so he had no choice but to make do with the suit he already had. On the designated day, they prepared themselves and started their dive. Keith had slightly more air in his tanks than Mike. Everything was going smoothly until Mike noticed that Keith seemed to be struggling with controlling his dry suit. Mike signaled to Keith, asking if he needed assistance, but Keith responded with an OK signal. However, as they descended to their agreed-upon depth, Mike checked his remaining air and realized he needed to begin ascending. He signaled to Keith, who acknowledged the signal. Unfortunately, as they made their way up, Keith realized that he had accidentally overinflated his dry suit, and his inflation bottle became trapped in a wedge. However, as Mike ascended, he never looked back, assuming that Keith was right behind him. Upon reaching the surface, Mike realized that his buddy was nowhere to be seen. Concerned, he felt the need to descend again to investigate what had gone wrong. Re-entering the water, he discovered that Keith was trapped in the guidelines and signaling for help. Mike managed to free him, but in the process, he depleted his air supply. Now relying on his pony bottle, a small emergency air source, Mike urgently signaled to Keith that he needed air to ascend safely. However, Keith, still disorganized from being trapped, initially failed to recognize the severity of the situation or offer any assistance. Finally, after regaining his composure, Keith recognized Mike's desperate need for air and assisted him in reaching the surface by sharing his reserve with him. Luckily, they made it out in time safely. A week after the previous incident, Mike and Keith planned their next dive and decided to incorporate the additional task of underwater photography into their expedition. After reaching the bottom of their dive site, they went in opposite directions to take some pictures. When Mike returned, he encountered a distressing situation. Keith was found inverted with his dry suit legs overinflated, causing him to remain at depth due to excess weight. Mike quickly checked on Keith, but was met with no response. Keith appeared to be unresponsive and had irregular breaths. Recognizing the severity of the situation, Mike swiftly took action. He inflated his buoyancy compensator to help bring Keith to the surface more rapidly. To reduce Keith's weight, Mike dropped his weight to approximately 17 pounds, ensuring that they could ascend safely. Throughout the ascent, Mike maintained his regulator in his mouth, allowing him to breathe underwater and provide a continuous air supply. Upon reaching the surface, it became evident that Keith had shallow breaths, and it was hard to detect his pulse. The presence of blood-tinged sputum, a mixture of saliva and blood, was observed coming from Keith's mouth, adding to the alarming circumstances. After Mike and Keith surfaced, 3 other divers who had already emerged from the water noticed their distress and hurried to their aid. Recognizing the seriousness of the situation, one of the divers immediately swam ahead to inform the authorities about the emergency unfolding in the water. Meanwhile, the other 2 divers began administering cardiopulmonary resuscitation to Keith, striving to revive him. This continued for up to 20 minutes, but regrettably, despite their determined endeavors, Keith was still unconscious. In response to the distress call, an ambulance promptly arrived at the scene. Keith was quickly transported to a nearby hospital, where the medical team swiftly assessed his condition. Since they dived up to 147 feet and recognized the potential complications related to diving emergencies, they decided to transfer Keith to a decompression chamber. The intention behind this treatment was to alleviate the effects of decompression sickness and potentially restore his condition. However, despite these efforts, the decompression did not yield any significant changes in Keith's condition. Tragically, Keith was eventually declared deceased. To gain further insights into the cause of his untimely passing, an autopsy was conducted. The autopsy revealed extensive lung barotrauma, indicating significant damage to the lungs caused by pressure changes during the dive. Additionally, bleeding was observed in the petraeus bones of the ears, suggesting the presence of injuries resulting from the pressure changes. It's worth noting that there was minimal evidence of coronary artery disease, indicating that heart-related issues were not the primary cause of Keith's unfortunate demise. This incident serves as an important reminder that no matter how experienced a diver may be, it is crucial to approach diving with the utmost caution and respect for the possible dangers and unpredictability of the underwater world. Experience alone cannot guarantee safety, as numerous factors at play can pose risks and challenges. It's vital to acknowledge any deficiencies in training, physical fitness, and equipment. Even seasoned divers can benefit from refresher dives after a prolonged period away from the activity. Regular practice and staying up to date with skills and knowledge are paramount to ensuring one's readiness for any unforeseen circumstances. Additionally, it is essential to assess the condition of diving equipment. Even if the gear appears to be in good working order, it is crucial to consider its suitability and effectiveness for individual needs. If the equipment no longer fits properly or fails to function optimally, it is prudent to consider replacing it to maintain a high level of safety. Moreover, it's crucial to make informed decisions about diving, considering various factors such as personal health, equipment reliability, environmental conditions, and other potential concerns. Opting out of a dive when any one of these factors are a cause for concern is a responsible and wise decision to prioritize personal safety. This was the 10th cave diving marathon on this channel. Let us know what you think in the comments section. If you enjoyed watching, take a dive on the like and subscribe buttons and hit the bell icon so you get notified when we come back with another exciting cave diving story.